Regrettably, a combat decision has already been taken and first troops already deployed. The Liberal leader and members hold the principle that the case for entering this or any war must be made openly and transparently and based on clear and reliable facts. Our men and women in uniform and all Canadians deserve no less. If the government's motivations and their actions are to be trusted, that means telling the full truth to Canadians and parliamentarians, but that has simply not happened, and the combat case has simply not been made. 1 month ago, the Liberals supported the government's 30-day non-combat advisory mission to help in the fight against the murderous radical group ISIL. Because Canada has a role to play in confronting humanitarian crises and security threats in the world. That too is a Liberal principle. And ISIL's brutal advance across Iraq into Kurdish territory, murdering opposition and innocent civilians, flaunting the beheadings of Western journalists and aid workers, could not be ignored. Canada's reputation confronting security and humanitarian threats on the world stage has a long history. Sur les champs de bataille des guerres mondiales,
on the war fields, and thanks to our courageous peacekeeping efforts, our reputation was hard won. After the Second World War, Canada's leadership helped build international organizations in order to reduce violence, promote peace, protect victims of genocide, and to hold international criminals accountable.
Relations were forged by Nobel Peace Prize winner Lester Pearson, advanced by Pierre Trudeau, progressive conservatives Joe Clark and Brian Mulroney, and solidified by Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin. The sacrifices of our armed force members and trainers in Afghanistan helped achieve a historic first in that country, a recent peaceful and democratic transition of their government. Yes, Canada does have a role to play to confront humanitarian crises and security threats and help build a better world. The question on the Liberals' minds this last month was this: after the 30-day mission, what will come next? Western interventions in the Iraq War of 2003 and the 2011 bombing of Libya and elsewhere failed. These Western interventions created instability that led to the rise of dozens of radical jihadist groups taking over vast swaths of the region today. How will this time be different? How can Canada and the coalition against ISIL contribute without sliding into a long, deadly war and perhaps make things worse? We must ensure that Canadians will not look back on this moment and say, how could government have been so wrong? The Conservative government did not even try to make a clear and thoughtful case for going to war in Iraq, nor to try and bring all parties on board. Sending women and men into harm's way is something that must never be done lightly, and expressions of outrage are no substitute for considering history's lessons. Mr. Speaker, consultations with military and diplomatic experts examining options, full and frank caucus discussions resulted in the Liberals recommending non-combat contributions. Western combat operations in the region will layer onto deep religious rivalries that date back centuries, an ethno-sectarian conflict dating back 98 years to the creation of these countries after World War I. While Canadians are rightly appalled by the brutal acts of murder by the extremely radical Islamists, Canada's foreign minister's rhetoric that this is simply about, in quote, bad people up to bad things, obscures the many geopolitical complexities at play. Post-war, the post-Iraqi war Maliki government governed for one religious sect at the expense of the Sunni and Kurds, using basic services, state institutions, distribution of revenues, even the justice system to repress and disadvantage Sunni Iraqis, among others. This disastrous governance and polarization enabled Sunni ISIL to quickly capture vast terrain and assets. Western combat deployment and civilian deaths could further bind moderate Sunni peoples to their radical brethren and power the jihadi surge. The International Crisis Group, until last month led by former Canadian Supreme Court Judge Justice Louise Arbour, considers the vital contribution to be addressing the underlying political issues that enable the insurgents' push. That's why it's critically important to support an inclusive and even-handed approach by the new government in Baghdad. That means strengthening the new Iraqi government and its armed forces, Let's build humanitarian capacity to protect brutalized populations. Let's strengthen the Peshmerga in defending Kurdish peoples in their homes and homelands. Let's train Iraqi security forces so they can defend their state on the ground. Let's engage moderate Sunni tribes so they reject rather than join the terrorists. And let's block ISIL's access to strategic communications and financial assets. Liberals believe that when the government deploys our men and women in uniform into combat, there must be a clear mission overall and a clear role for Canada. Until the coalition of 60 diverse nations fighting ISIL has a clear combat role for stopping ISIL, there is no clear combat role for Canada at this time. Yesterday, General John Allen, the head of the Global Coalition to Counter ISIL, said he will start traveling in the region over the next month for the work of bringing the coalition together, sorting out the kind of effort needed, and start to place each member's unique capabilities within those lines. No, Canada's combat role and goals are not yet clear. So what should Canada's contribution be? Secretary of State John Kerry said at the UN, and I quote, "There's an important role for every country to play in the fight against ISIL. That means each according to their unique capabilities." That's a statement. That's a statesman. Contrast that with the Foreign Affairs Minister's claim that either Canada takes a combat role or, and I quote, "sits back and lets someone else do the heavy lifting." Go to war or be a free rider. That's small thinking, facile, divisive, and unworthy. A key Liberal principle is that Canada's role reflect the broad scope and uniqueness of Canadian capabilities: financial, humanitarian, diplomatic, democratic, military. So let's not rush into combat without thinking carefully about our best contributions. What are the significant non-combat roles Canada can play, military and non-military alike? What is the range of humanitarian aid so desperately needed? Let's consider the signals intelligence, military airlift capability, surveillance, medical support, protection of civilians and aid workers, forces training that Canada might offer. Our dedicated men and women who serve in Canada's armed forces are second to none in the world, and there are many ways they can contribute. Yesterday, General Allen spoke of his, in quote, "intent to use coalition forces in a very important way to train the existing Iraqi security forces." Canada would be uniquely positioned to do just that. In 2009, crack Canadian troops began an intensive 4-year training mission in Afghanistan. Almost 1,000 troops on the ground, with rotations coming in and going out. They trained the Afghan National Army, Air Force, and the National Police. And this past spring, the last of them came home. These military men and women made a tremendous contribution to Afghanistan's stability. They could also so contribute in Iraq. Canadians are concerned that Canada's combat role will escalate. But Canada's Chief of Defence Staff, General Tom Lawson, told the government in November last year, and I quote, "Without at least maintaining current funding levels, we will directly affect the readiness of key fleets of aircraft, ships, and army vehicles. This in turn has an overall impact upon training and readiness." But the budget cuts and clawbacks have continued. So how will this new mission be funded? And finally, to respect the Canadian people's stake in this war, and in the interest of trust and accountability, I call on the government to, 1, adopt the Manley Panel recommendations on Afghanistan, requiring the government to provide quarterly mission updates to Parliament. 2, adopt the U.S. practice of regular public military briefings by senior military officials. 3, make clear its airstrike rules of engagement and whether the U.S. will be in command of targets. 4, agree to a parliamentary committee study of the strategic aims of the anti-ISIL campaign. And lastly, require the National Security Advisor to brief the Defence Committee on the overall use of Canadian intelligence capabilities in the campaign against ISIL. Mr. Speaker, transparency and honesty has been lacking, and I want to ask the government to provide it over the critical weeks and months ahead as our brave men and women go forth on this difficult mission. Thank you.
Honourable Member for Vancouver Quadra.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry to hear this member using the same tactic of rhetoric over reasoning in this very important situation. And I might point out that it is imperative to learn from past lessons. And apparently this government wants to ignore lessons learned. But in terms of the kind of undermining of the opposition parties for choosing to support a non-combat role, I would like to point out that this member's colleague, the Foreign Affairs Minister, slammed the opposition parties for a non-combat role stand, saying that the Socialist Democratic government in Italy is supportive, the Socialist Democratic coalition in Germany is supportive, and in fact, yes, they are supportive of making a contribution, as are the Liberals. But the minister neglected to mention that neither Germany nor Italy is sending strike fighter planes, nor taking on a combat role. More example of the kind of dishonesty that undermines the trust of Canadians in this very mission.
Questions and comments customary come on tide. The honourable member for Ottawa Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank my colleague for her intervention. There is a critical question that I think needs to be answered here, and it goes back to in September when we laid out what we wanted to see, and that was to have a debate and a vote at the time. We, in fact, quoted the Prime Minister when he was opposition leader as to why we should have a debate and vote. He wanted to change the standing orders along with Jack Layton at the time. But I wasn't clear, and I want clarity from my Liberal friend, is the position of the Liberal Party that when we are deploying troops, that we should have a debate but also a vote, because this is extraordinarily important that we know that we have the full confidence of the House when we're deploying troops abroad. So I'd like to nail down the position of the Liberal Party on that particular question.
The honourable member for Vancouver Quadra, you have about 50 seconds.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think we've been pretty clear about what our positions are, and that's that there needs to be openness and transparency in considering these issues, which there hasn't been. It's that Canada does respond, take a role in humanitarian crises and security threats. It's that we must find the best and highest contribution for Canadians to make. So those are our positions, Mr. Speaker. Those are the ones that we've been advancing, including advancing through calling an emergency debate in Parliament on this issue several weeks ago.